Great. Okay, so welcome to our final PSIR faculty lecture series of the semester. So we have a guest speaker today, Balihar. Sanghera will be talking about rentier capitalism in Central Asia. So we're very much anticipating this talk. So, so please, Balihar, I pass the floor on to you.
Thank you, Brian, and just before I do begin, just thank you for organising this and for being persistent about the event. Because I know we had a bit of problems organising this, so I really do appreciate this. And also to Alexei, who I met a long time ago, who initially suggested that I should give a talk to Nazarbayev, so I'm grateful to him as well. And obviously grateful to colleagues who can participate. I know it's the end towards the last week of term, and people are already on holiday mode, and I'm really grateful for your attending this, especially given that it's evening in Nur-Sultan. Okay, so let me just share my slides. So just bear with me whilst I do that. Okay, can you all see that? Yeah, is that good? Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. Okay, so so this talk is very much based on the book that Amira Setabaideva and I have undertaken over the last kind of project that we began almost 17 years ago. But the book itself came out last year. So this is a joint work very much with Amira. Sadly, Amira couldn't be with us to join us. We usually take turns about who's going to give talks. She gave the previous one, so it was mine to give this one. I'm going to try to explain what rentier capitalism is. Also try to suggest how this has resulted in some sort of activism movements against this form of capitalism in Central Asia. And I will do so by trying to incorporate this within what I call the moral economy perspective. So there will be some various key points to this talk. Firstly, what is rent? What is meant by rent? And hopefully I will, during the talk, expand on the notion of rent from its kind of traditional understanding of rent to a more broader, more common and legal form of rent seeking. I will also suggest why both Amir and I think that rent is more dangerous for the economy, democracy and the planet. In fact, I suggest that rent is more dangerous than Russia. And then I suggest here how rentier capitalism has resulted in the formation of counter-movements, grassroots activism against rent, income extraction. And we'll try to do this within the framework that Amir and I have around a moral economy perspective, which seeks to not only to explain the nature of capitalism, but also to evaluate it, to assess their effects. But before doing all this, let me tell you what happened at the beginning of January. Your colleagues here will be familiar with what happened at the start of the year in January, when in the country there was huge protest over the increase in price of liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG, sometimes dubbed as the road fuel for the poor. So the 1st of January, there was this doubling of the price, which brought out a lot of the poor against this hiking of this fuel price, which a lot of the poor, the working class, use for their everyday needs and even transport. The state, the government, justified the lifting of the cap because there was initially a cap on the LPG, and it removed the cap, justifying it that it was a way of liberalizing the market, and also furthermore to tackling the illegal trade of LPG, because often the LPG was cheaper in Kazakhstan. It was more expensive over in neighboring countries, so there was an illegal trade. So the government justified it on two forms. Firstly, this is what free market is. It's about liberalizing prices. Let the price be dictated by demand and supply, the free market ideology. And secondly, around tackling illegal trade. Now, the big winners of this lifting of the price cap were going to be obviously the owners of the petrol stations, who were going to make significant gains as a result of selling LPG at a much higher price. It's probably no accident that Timur Kulibayev, a couple of years before this, had privatized a network, a significant network of petrol stations before this event happened. So obviously he was going to be the biggest gainer of this, given that he owned a significant share of the petrol stations in the country. What we saw over the a week or so after the introduction of the price hike of LPG was the working class, the poor, coming out to the streets protesting over this. In response to this, we saw the state using violence to crush and quell the protest, both through the police and the armed forces. We're not quite sure how many people died or how many were injured, but it's suggested that there were at least, conservative estimates suggest around 300 deaths and over 3,000 injuries as a result of this suppressing of the protests. It's probably interesting also, I think, colleagues, that the middle classes, who were probably least likely to be affected by the hike of the price of the LPG, that they sought and largely favored the violence against the protesters on the grounds that this was the restoration of law and order. Into the second week of the protest, with condemnation around the world ringing in his ears, the President Tokayev, initially very forceful in his condemnation of the protesters, so offered more conciliatory tones, arguing that firstly postponing the price increase for 6 months, and then suggesting how there was a significant inequality within the country, and that he would then establish a new social fund to help to redistribute income. This new social fund would be voluntary, in which the rich, the oligarchs, would be able to make contributions. Now, this, colleagues, is familiar to you, and no doubt you have more details and nuance given your proximity to the events that took place in January. What I will argue is that in many ways, this event, this protest that happened around, firstly over the increase in the LPG, but also the protest and the violence, epitomizes the nature of Rentier capitalism. And that's the argument that Amir and I make in the book. Though obviously we don't use LPG here because it's obviously the book preceded the event, but it's an illustration, I think, of how Rentier capitalism and its discontent occurs. probably worth saying, colleagues, that Almir and I, we didn't necessarily start our research many years ago looking at frontier capitalism. In fact, our concern was much more simpler than that. What we were interested in were the forms of suffering and harm that were taking place in Central Asia, both in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And what we had seen over the many projects that we had done in Central Asia was the kind of the sense of powerlessness, despair, anger, the sense of injustice that people were feeling. Firstly, the level of indebtedness that a lot of rural but also urban classes had, and indebtedness as a result of borrowing money and then having to pay exorbitant interest on the loans that they had. Often, interest could be up to 60%, especially in rural parts of Kyrgyzstan. In Kazakhstan, interests are also significantly high in comparison to developed or high-income countries in Europe, for instance. Also, the sense in which people were suffering or their sense of well-being damaged as a result of being homeless or having inadequate housing. The emergence of informal settlements around major cities like Bishkek, Almaty. Colleagues, I'm sure you're well aware of what happened in Shanarak in 2005, when a police officer was captured by the informal settlements because the then mayor of the city, Almaty, wanted to bulldoze the illegal settlements to gentrify the property to build lavish homes and shopping malls. The lack of housing was, and as I said, and still remains a considerable problem in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and it hasn't gone away. And housing still remains a key issue for many middle and working class people. The precarity of work and the conditions in which people work, both in the country but also overseas, whether they be migrating in Russia or working elsewhere. The considerable environmental pollution and damage caused by the energy and mining companies, whether it be Chevron or ExxonMobil or BP in Kazakhstan, or whether it be Sanghera in Kyrgyzstan over the gold mine. It has been a huge concern, the loss of mines, the loss of glaciers in the mountainous part of Kumtor in Kyrgyzstan, or the loss of marine life in Kashagan, for instance. The significant inequality that exists in both in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, I will talk about this a bit more, in which we have the very poor, but also the very rich. The figures that I once saw was that 147 individuals in Kazakhstan own 50% of all wealth in the country. So let me just say that again. 147 individuals in Kazakhstan own 50% of all wealth in the country. That's obviously, huge level of wealth concentration in the hands of the few, which then leads to, or invariably correlates with political power as well. So we have the emergence of what I would call plutocracy, the rule of the rich. It's not, colleagues, I avoid the use of oligarch. Oligarch from the Greek means, of course, the rule of the few. I think we can be a bit more precise in the nature of a political regime in Central Asia, but also the former Soviet space. It's plutocracy. It's the rule of the rich, not the few, but the rich, that that is troubling. And of course, this is a world, it's not just something that happens in the former Soviet space, but also happens elsewhere, whether it be in Ukraine, Georgia, or more recently in United States, when Trump was the president of the country. The sense of lack of political participation by local communities as a result of this unequal power, both economic and political. And finally, colleagues, the other part that both Sanghera and I found was the huge level of corruption, corporate corruption, fraud taking place on a systematic level that kind of caused many people to wonder why they had even embarked on this kind of road towards market economy. Now, the usual explanation, colleagues, is that these economies are crippled by kleptocracy, just corruption, and the term crony capitalism is usually bandied around, or several years ago, the term clan politics was popular, wasn't it? To talk about how political rule was clan-based, kingship-based, or increasingly that is more authoritarian. And the argument here is that if only these economies became proper democracies, the situation would be hugely improved for the average Central Asian person. And then I suppose the problem with this about, and I know the term crony capitalism has been, as I said, has been bandied around and it's got kind of some sort of mileage with certain commentators. I suppose what Alme and I argue is that crony capitalism or crony or corruption or kleptocracy is an outcome. It's not a cause of the suffering that I just spoke about earlier. It's almost like Plato's cave. People mistaking the shadows as if they're real. Well, they're not real. They're just outcomes of something else. But invariably, they see the shadows for being real entities. The other explanation that's usually given is that the economic development in the countries have been hindered by absence of rule of law, judicial and legal structures. And if only there were proper independent judiciary, and proper respect for property rights, we would have in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan a properly functioning economies that served not just for the few, but for all. I suppose with both these explanations, these sets of explanations, both Alme and I kind of find them to be lacking considerable flaws in them. Partly, firstly, colleagues, is that there's no analysis of capital or class, which is totally missing. We don't know the nature of the dynamics of capital or the understanding of any notion of how class empowers one group over another. So that's just totally missing in the analysis, as if capitalism doesn't exist. Capitalism does bring about inequalities, does bring about various problems, and these often require proper, adequate analysis. Moreover, colleagues, the idea that the Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan moved from a command economy to a free market economy just requires more interrogation, because what does a free market mean? What does it refer to? What was the vision of the architects of the neoliberal reforms when they were envisaging a free market economy? Well, what did that actually look like? What were they trying to achieve? And hopefully, during the course of this presentation, I will outline the nature of the free market and why it resulted in the problems that I outlined earlier, the various forms of suffering and harms that took place, from indebtedness to plutocracy and environmental damage. So it's worth saying here that we do have a class within Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. It's called the Rentier class. I will explain what the Rentier class is in a moment, but just take it as a given that there is this class who are able to make money on the basis of ownership and control of assets, valuable, scarce assets. They're not capitalists, they are rentiers, right? Because whereas capitalists make money through the production of commodities, rentiers make money on existing assets, assets that already exist. And they're able to make money because they have monopoly power and they can charge high prices for those commodities that other people want and need. So there's a distinction here, colleagues, between profit and rent. And clearly what I'm focusing here is on rent. The importance of rent in Central Asian economies, in which individuals are able to extract income, i.e. rent, because they have ownership of valuable key assets, finance, land, natural resources, ownership of utilities, natural monopolies, etc. Colleagues, I know you're all aware of what rent is. You already have some notion of what rent is, and often rent is usually referred to either in terms of natural resources, so we think about the rentier state, right? Or we think about it in the more political sense as rent seeking in the public sector. So we think about it as political corruption, as in the kind of James Buchanan and Attell on the public choice theory. And in both cases, they see rent as being bad, as leading to distortions and being illegal in one form or another, either being ruinous for the development or leading to corruption within the sector in which rentier rent seekers operate. So it's either so it has this kind of implicit illicit element, illegal element to it. But what Almer and I argue is that rent is much more routine, common, and legal, and more varied than that. And actually, it has a legal basis as well. So, so interest, the money that's charged on money, that's rent, pure and simple. Capital gains, that's also rent. The buying and selling of apartments, buying and selling of existing assets in the secondary market is a form of rent, right? Nothing new is produced, but people are able to capture surplus through a monopoly power or on the ability that they have something which is scarce. Quasi-monopoly prices like LPG that I began to talk with earlier, that was also a form of rent. The ability to hike up prices because you control the market, that's rent. Ground rent, land rent, housing rent, the landlords being able to charge exorbitant housing prices, high prices for property because there's a lack of supply or there's a shortage of proper housing. Charges on broadbands, mobile phones, internet connections, license fees, property rights, right? These are patents. These are all forms of rent. And they're all legal. And importantly, colleagues, they operate not in the public sector, but in the private sector, right? These are operated by corporates, not by state officials, public officials, but by corporations operating in the private sector, who are able to use their power in the market to extract rent from the users. Moreover, you also have a group of people who are part of the rentier economy, rentier ecology, insofar as they are second but removed, in that they help the rentier class. So there could be your private developers, people who make luxury houses and then sell them on to rich individuals who then rent them out or sell them. Well, they're part of the rentier class. Accountants, lawyers, financial advisors, or wealth asset managements. These are also part of the rentier class, rentier ecology, insofar as they further the development of rent extraction in the economy. So whilst they may not be the rentiers themselves, they act on behalf of the rentier class. And I've got here a table, colleagues, of the 10 richest individuals in Kazakhstan. And this list, I'm sure, will be familiar to you. I obtained this from Forbes 2019. And what you will see are those names from Vladimir Kim to the Kulibayevs there. Now, what I want you to pay attention to, and I apologize if it is very wordy, it's the third column, the key economic sectors in which these individuals make their money. And there's a trend there, isn't there? If you look at it, there's a commonality, there's a familiarity in how the richest individuals in Kazakhstan make their money. See the number of times, the frequency by which banking, finance, minerals pop up, because this is how they make their money. They make their money because they have property rights over minerals, money, finance. Some also in Vladimir and Bulat in the telecommunication, because mobile charges, that's a form of rent as well. Interestingly, also the Kulibayevs also have retail properties, shopping malls, again, because of their rental value. They're able to charge the shops rent for operating in their malls. So as I said, just look at the frequency by which banking, finance, energy pops up over again. And when we look at a similar list of the 10 richest individuals in Kyrgyzstan, we also see a similar pattern around banking, finance, real estate, less so about minerals, interestingly, but that probably explains that Kazakhstan has more minerals, energy than Kyrgyzstan. So you would expect a difference in there, but there's a stronger frequency of rentiers or richest individuals making money on the basis of their real estate, ownership of real estate. So these could be apartments that they buy and sell or they rent, or shopping malls or markets that they own, which they lease out to others. Construction companies is a considerable part of this group of individuals' ability to make rent, insofar as it's part of their kind of a rentier ecology. The boom in housing in Kyrgyzstan, in which elite housing or luxury apartments were built, which were then either left unoccupied because they were used as a form of assets, in which the prices would then rise over time, or they were often sometimes leased to other people for their rent. So the argument that Amir and I make is that what we see in Central Asia is an example of rentier capitalism. So whilst there's a tendency to focus on the natural resource rent or the illegal public sector rent seeking, what gets omitted is the more benign, not benign, the more mundane, the more common and legal forms of rent, such as interest through banking, rent through property, capital gains through buying and selling of assets, including property and estates, dividends, shares for ownership of shares, as well as platform rents, spectrum operating mobile phones. It's the mobile companies have ownership of a spectrum, a radio spectrum, which they then are able to use to charge high prices. And what we argue is that whilst the first part, the first form of rents, the public sector rent seeking and natural resource receives critical scrutiny, there's lack of scrutiny, or there's an absence of any coverage of the more private sector form and legal forms of rent seeking. So we define, Amir and I, we define rent as the unequal ownership and control of existing assets, of scarce assets and resources such as minerals, energy, finance, real estate, spectrum rents, spectrum, radio spectrum, platforms. These are all forms of assets that people own, which then gives rise to two classes of individuals: the rentier class, the property class, who own these very valuable assets, who then dominate the propertyless class, who require these resources, who require money, land, to be able to function, require utilities, water, electricity, gas, the use of mobile phones, yet don't have ownership of those, but have to pay high prices for them. And colleagues, what's interesting about this is that this form of rent has another name. It's called unearned income. Under the Soviet Union, rent was criminalized because it was seen as something that didn't arise from labor. It was unproductive labor. It was unproductive form of income, which arose not from use of one's labor to creatively produce goods, commodities, but rather was based merely on one's ability to own assets. And for that reason, it was termed as unearned income. It obviously comes from classical political economy, from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mills, to Keynes, to R.H. Toney, John Hobson, as well as obviously I missed out Ricardo. Ricardo also, they talked about earned income, which arises from labor, and unearned income. And for them, unearned income was a deadweight loss and an unjust form of enrichment because it had no basis for justification. There was nothing to justify this ability for people to make income, mainly because of their ownership of assets, producing nothing but increased prices. But what we've seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union is how neoliberalism has justified and has expanded rent. So whereas previously rent, unearned income, was criminalized, was seen as something wrong and speculative and parasitic, now it has become normalized, institutionalized in the very workings of the economies in Central Asia, but not just in Central Asia, of course, throughout the world. And this is a kind of a pictorial illustration of the argument that Amir and I make, in which you have the asset poor, the propertyless class, and the asset rich, the rentiers, who, through their ability to own scarce resources, are able to obtain payments so that the asset poor are able to access goods that they need and want. So the relationship between, for example, the lenders and borrowers, between banks and customers, is one of essential relationship in which the lenders have ownership and control of money credit often, and the borrowers need credit, especially to deal with emergency money or the uneven flow of their income. And because the lenders have this kind of monopolistic power, this quasi-monopoly power, they're able to charge considerably high interest so that the borrowers can use these credit for themselves. Now, the lenders don't do anything. They just put the money into the borrower's account. It's the borrowers who have to make the surplus. It's the borrowers who have to do the work. It's the borrowers who have to either, if they're a business, have to produce the goods and sell them. If they're farmers, to sow and harvest their crops, or if they are workers, to work in factories or offices and produce services that people will buy from them. The lenders are merely parasitic. They just lend the money. They don't do any work. They don't contribute to wealth creation at all. They just extract the income from the borrowers. And the same structural relationship exists between the landlords and the tenants. The landlords already have the existing property, and they are just able to charge high housing rent to tenants. But it's the tenants who have to make the payment, who have to obtain. And how do they make the payment? Well, they have to do the work. They have to create a surplus for themselves in order for them to live on, but also to create a surplus to pay off the rent. And the buying and selling of apartments, whether it be new or existing ones, that's also a form of capital gains, a form of rent. Again, nothing is produced. It's the home buyers who have to create the surplus. And likewise with the utility companies, who are able to hike up the price of goods, and it's left to the customers to come up with the money, having to work harder, longer, in order to meet the higher prices. It's probably worth saying here that Amir and I, we do use the moral economy perspective here. And it's probably worth saying, well, what is the moral economy perspective? Well, the moral economy perspective here has three parts. Firstly, it kind of examines how moral rules, norms, justifications, and power constitute economic practices and institutions. So in that sense, all economies are moral economies. You can't have an economy without the norms and rules that underpin them. Property rights is a particular example of rules that underpin the capitalist economies. Secondly, is that it seeks to evaluate economic practices in terms of their implications on people's well-being. We can't, as social scientists, we can't be neutral to people's suffering and flourishing, because economic arrangements, institutions affect people's well-being. The very fact that it affects people's well-being, whether it be through high prices or exclusion to valuable assets, is likely to affect their ability to live well. So in that sense, social analysis, economic analysis cannot avoid normative implications. We do have to take into account how existing economic practices are likely to affect people's ability to flourish. So in that sense, value is an important part of social analysis, or too often in political economy or sociological inquiry, we tend to divorce value from fact and just say that we just need to be objective and leave the values outside. But no, values is an integral part of the social analysis because of its impact on people's well-being. And in relation to that, social scientists can't be indifferent to making assessment of whether the norms and justifications and the practices are reasonable or not. We've got to take a line. We've got to be able to say whether things are good or bad, because people do that all the time. People do make assessments. People do make judgments about to what extent economic practices, activities are likely to be beneficial or harmful. And if it's harmful, it's a form of immoral economies. And then the third part of that is of the moral economy perspective, is to understand individuals, not just merely as agents, as if they're just rational individuals who just deliberate, as if the world, as if they just live in autonomous kind of surroundings, but rather they inhabit a world in which their relationship to it is one of care and concern. They do make judgments about how social relationships are likely to be wrong or right, good or bad, because they are evaluative beings. They evaluate the harms that impact them. They're likely to be appreciative of the benefits that the world has for them, but they're also likely to make judgments about the negative side of the world. Now, sorry, Brian, how long do I have? Sorry, I'm a bit conscious of time. Sorry.
I suppose the next, if you could, the next 5 to 10 minutes, kind of.
Okay, 10 minutes.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay,
great, cheers. So, firstly, it's worth saying that the institutions sought to justify rent extraction. And how did it do? And lenders, property developers, and the international corporations, energy and mineral corporations, all sought to justify rent. Lenders in our study, Amir and I found that often lenders justified high interest because they said they imagined that the market was a site of individual freedom, choice, and equality. So they used the kind of, the ideal version of the market. They also felt that borrowers had a moral duty to honor their promises to repay the high loans. And the sanctity of contracts had to be an important part of the legal establishment, so that the judiciary had to ensure that the borrowers who were defaulting had to either pay up, or if they couldn't pay up, their collateral was taken from them. So they were dispossessed of any property that they had in order to meet the loans, outstanding loans. So the sanctity of the contracts, the honoring of one's promises, were all these moral discourses that were used and norms that were used to justify rent extraction. Moreover, the corporations, energy corporations, talked about the importance of the rule of law and the international rule of law and the right to property as the basis for their rent extraction. So a lot of the energy companies signed up what was called production sharing agreements with the governments, both in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and these were legally binding agreements. And moreover, the United States, European countries signed with Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan international investment treaties, which bounded each country to protecting the property rights and ensuring that the state, the host state, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, could not nationalize or expropriate the earnings of the foreign investors. So these were the forms of moral justifications, norms that were used to ensure that the domestic and foreign rentier class, lenders, property developers, energy companies were able to extract income unhindered by the state. But nevertheless, the state was important in this because, as I said, as I mentioned earlier, the state was a crucial. We don't see the state, Almer and I don't see the state as weak in any form at all. In fact, the state is very strong. It just happens to be strong for the rich and poor and weak for the poor. So the state legitimized unearned income by creating a neoliberal regime of property rights. It decriminalized unearned income and speculation. It allowed usury, rent, capital gains, which were all criminalized under the Soviet Union. It deregulated and desupervised the key markets, finance, property, and natural resources. And colleagues, I think this is the other key part to this story. In classical political economy, Adam Smith, Ricardo, John Stuart Mills, Keynes, R.H. Tony, Hobson, and Attell, what they meant by free market was the market should be free of rent. So it required the state to regulate rentier activities. That's what they meant. In classical political economy, free market meant free of rent. And the state had to take action to ensure that the monopoly powers, people of privilege, could not extract rent. Why? Because rent was just a form of unjust enrichment, but also it just led to higher prices, uncompetitiveness. That's why, that was one strong reason by Adam Smith, for instance. Under neoliberalism, what we see is that what free market means under neoliberalism is markets are allowed to freely extract rent, free of state control. That's what that's what free market now means. It's a total reversal of the classical political economy. Now, in terms of the harmful effects, and this is the part that I think is worth reiterating here. There are three key harms that have arisen and why we can't be neutral. Why social analysis has to involve has had normative dimensions. Because what we see is that the political elites align themselves with rentier interests in controlling scarce assets. So the top 20 richest individuals in Kazakhstan were all linked to the then president Nazarbayev, and others benefited from his patronage. In Kyrgyzstan, the top 20 individuals held senior political positions as prime ministers, government officials, city mayors, speakers, and parliamentarians. The international global order largely limited state control and limited democratic decision-making in support of the investor class. That's what it did. That's the nature of politics. What neoliberalism also did, as well as expanding and legitimizing rentierism and plutocracy, it weakened regulatory settlements and resulted in corruption and criminogenic environment. Commodification and the neoliberal norms resulted in fraudulent practices, corrupt practices. And we see this over and over again. The 2007-2008 crisis, the global one, which was made in the United States, was a result of corruption, fraudulent practices. And we see this again taking place in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Predatory lending, malpractices in Kyrgyzstan within the banking sector, violation of building codes, bribery given to the city mayors in order to appropriate land, prime sites for their apartment complex, both in Almaty and in Bishkek. And the oil industries undertaking predatory drilling, the unsafe storage of toxic chemicals, labor violation, manipulation of data on pollution, again, in order to expedite the drilling that favors the shareholders of Chevron, ExxonMobil, BP, and other international corporations. And of course, what this also leads to is the other harmful effect around the environment. Already mentioned the rapid shrinkage of glaciers at the Kumtor gold mine, the loss of biodiversity, high levels of toxicity around the Kashagan and Tenging regions. And then the sheer violation of regulatory rules governing the monitoring and prosecution of environmental regulations. Now, what this has also has resulted in is the other part of the story, which is the resistance, because this has brought about a backlash against this rentierism, against the indebtedness, the homelessness, the environmental damage, a sense of insecurity, shame, all these things. What Amer and I call the Palanian double movement, the counter movement. And what we saw in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan were grassroots resistance. And important colleagues, it's not here, these weren't funded by NGOs, these weren't funded by rich donors, USAID or George Soros Foundation. These were grassroots movements who were reacting to the suffering, the loss of dignity that they were facing in themselves, in their surrounding. These were grassroots movements, unrelated to the middle class NGOs that often tend to stay away from these kinds of issues. So we saw, and then the book kind of expands on the anti-debt movements, the land and housing movements to legalize and to regularize informal settlements, environmental movements, labor movements, trade union movements, more so in Kazakhstan around the oil industry, to have independent trade unions rather than owner-led trade unions. And all these movements were forms of trying to decommodify what had been commodified under neoliberalism. So, these were images of protests outside the US Embassy in Kyrgyzstan to eradicate microfinance. Microfinance all too often has been touted as as a way of empowering the women and the poor. They weren't. There were forms of entrapment into paying high interest to private lenders. And often these private lenders, particularly the microfinance, had been set up by USAID and Western development banks. Likewise, there were anti-debt movements in Kazakhstan. These were more kind of middle class. They're more around mortgages and trying to reduce the mortgage interest rates. Less, and then these were more urban as opposed to rural. Just images again, colleague, just about the different protests that occurred. Sorry, I do a slide, but lack of time to talk about the housing movement in the four cities, Nur-Sultan, Almaty, Bishkek, and Osh. Protests around the gold mine in Kumtor. And of course, you colleagues will be already familiar with this, about the protests against oil corporations by the oil workers who seek to nationalize the industry as a way of ensuring greater pay and better working conditions. And what we saw is that these movements were largely limited in their success, to be honest. They were often class divided. The middle classes tend to have different ideas of what they wanted to pursue from the working class. While social movements were able to obtain limited concessions, by and large, they were unable to overcome the power, the alliance of the transnational capital and domestic capital. It was just far too strong. Moreover, you have the state acting on behalf of the capital class, the rentier class. But nevertheless, what these movements, grassroots movements, tried to show was the level of discontent about the trajectory of economic development in the region. and they raised important moral questions about what is deserved income, what is undeserved income. And finally, if I can just finish on this, and then apologies, Brian, I know I've gone over time. How do we then evaluate frontierism? And on a multiple criteria of evaluation of rentierism, the ability to make money through mere ownership and control of assets, it's just immoral, just wrong, both in terms of contributed justice, because property just becomes a vehicle by which people obtain unearned income. It's not earned income at all. It results in distributive, unequal distribution of income and wealth, which is undeserved. Remember the quote that I gave, that 147 people in Kazakhstan, only 50% of the wealth. How do they get that? Is it because they work so many times harder than the rest? Clearly not. That's not how they work. They get their income because they own assets. They have ownership of private property which is then defended by the judiciary. So the judiciary is a key part of this component in supporting the rentier class. Furthermore, the plutocracy that occurs both at the national level as well as the local level, the city level, the environmental injustice, the destruction to the local ecosystem, and finally, just people leading miserable lives because they just can't afford access to services because they're having to pay rent to to the renting class. Okay, thank you, and again, my apologies for overrunning. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you for your talk. Okay, so let's open the floor to comments, questions, if you need to gather your thoughts. Any comments? I guess I can begin, and then we'll go from here. I mean, so I actually teach anarchism here at the university, and we read Proudhon. You know, that rent is a form of theft. You put it much more nicely it's under an income rather than theft. But so typically the leftist response is an aggressive treatment of these mechanisms of divergence. So, you know, attack heritable goods, you know, so limit the bequest, you know, limit the flow of capital abroad, eliminate tax havens, aggressive, and even nationalizing of these sort of national, you know, kind of goods. So what is the appropriate balance here? You know, because presumably we can't eliminate all rent. So how do we proceed, and what's the appropriate kind of balance?
Oh, great question, Brian. And you're right. Rent, as I said, it comes in all forms and shapes, all forms of sizes and shapes, right? Clearly, what I've been talking about here are the big players, right? The large rentier class. Of course, we're also, Brian, I suspect you and we probably have a bit of pension fund lying around, or we have some shares. We are probably more kind of petty rentiers, right? We probably have income deposit in banks, in which earns interest. Well, that's a form of rent, isn't it? That we obtain, right? So there are, you know, as I said, it comes in different shapes and sizes, and clearly, what I'm more focusing is on the more egregious forms of rent extraction, because you're right, it'd be difficult, I think, at this stage to eliminate all forms of rent. You know, but we can do certain things about limiting the power of the big players, right? Whether it be the banks, the property developers, the mobile operators, the digital, the tech giants that own the platforms, the energy companies, the natural monopolies, and the forms they can take something that you already alluded to, Brian, about nationalizing. You can nationalize certain companies, right? There's no reason why the oil companies or the banks should be in private hands and just serving the interests of the select few. It can be in the hands of the state to ensure that rent, that interest is not charged at exorbitant interest. So I think these would be some of the forms that I would suggest. I think you can. I mean, that'd be more radical, right? Nationalization. If you didn't want to pursue that radical element, you could think about capping interest. I mean, this is what in Kazakhstan they did about interest rates. They capped the level of interest, but it was still high though. This is the problem. It was at a high threshold. So there's an element in which you can cap. I'm certainly up for the idea that we should have high wealth tax, so that inheritance tax, or what's sometimes called the death tax. So when a rich individual dies and passes on their asset inheritance to the next counterpart, the next kin, well, it should be taxed. Should be taxed at a considerable level. All too often, and this is the interesting thing, Brian, isn't it? That tax on earned income is higher than tax on unearned income. I mean, this is the tragedy, isn't it? It's a tragedy that taxation, all too often, especially in the West, it's at a much higher level. When you're actually producing goods and services, useful things, you're taxed at a higher level than if you were doing nothing with your assets and you just having unearned income. And I think we need to change that. So, there should be a higher capital gains tax, as I said, as well as inheritance tax. So hopefully that gives you an idea.
Great, thank you.
Oh, but I should say, of course, I'm not trying to. I mean, a more radical approach, Brian, of course, is we should try to do away with capitalism, right? I mean, I'm not saying the system is fine. I mean, just without rentierism, wouldn't it be great? No, I mean, we're still left with the fundamental problem between the exploitation between capital and labor, and how do we then seek to ensure that capitalism, as Marx and other neo-Marxists have quite rightly pointed out, how this results in unfairness as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, Janibek.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Sanghera. It's very interesting, and I haven't read your book yet, so hopefully I'll get my copy soon. This is a kind of relatively new topic to me, so I just want to clarify several moments. While listening to your presentation, I was just kind of keep asking what is different or similar in the case of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, let's say, when we compare these countries to developed countries, or not developed, but liberal democracies, let's say, because many of the things that you mentioned seem to be very kind of similar in democratic societies as well. The second thing is, and then you partly answered this, I guess, in a previous answer, the banking system that you mentioned, that kind of is repeated everywhere. I mean, for instance, Kaspi Bank in Kazakhstan is owned by Vladimir Kim, right? #1 in the Forbes ranking. But this is the bank that has transformed the whole banking sector in the country. Yes, they do provide new service. They do provide they bring some novelty into the sector. And in that sense, whether we can still consider this as a kind of rentier, because again, all banks all over the world are owned by a few people, and then this kind of thing. The second thing is the property and malls that you mentioned, right? And it's not, again, I don't think that it's unique to Kazakhstan or to Central Asia, and how it's different and similar to the cases of democratic countries, right? And this is a follow-up question. Is rentier capitalism about, let's say, access to resources, or is it about ownership, how people get ownership of certain assets, let's say, or is it about how they make profit of it? So in that sense, whether it's a kind of the rentier capital with this issue, is this issue more about economic or more about political, if you see what I mean? So what is the kind of thing? The second question would be, you mentioned the case of Kumtor, Kashagan, Tengiz, and all this are related to international networks, corporations, right? So what is the role of these international networks, let's say, in this the country-based or the regional rentier capitalism? And the last question, possibly, if I may, relates to this latest developments, political developments in the country that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation. So now the president and all of the official kind of discourse talks a lot about this rentier capitalism, about oligarchs, about the thing that in Kazakhstan, I mean, that they have to pay back to the people. They've established this fund, the foundation, right? So how do you think, is there any kind of hope that this kind of change, and what are the prerequisites for the change in terms of the political kind of and economic reforms in the country? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Zenabek, and some really great questions there. I don't know whether I'll be able to do justice to them in the short moment that we have, but I'll certainly give it a try. We mustn't assume that the economies of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan operate in silos from the rest of the world, that it somehow operates in isolation. It's very much integrated in part of the global economy, the global capital, right? The global market. So the similarities that you point out, Zenabek, shouldn't be too surprising, should it? Because it is integrated into the global capitalism, the global market. It would be odd, I think, to talk about capitalism as if it operates in isolation from the rest of the world. What kind of global capital is that? Clearly, as you know, Zenabek, a lot of the capital comes from outside. You know, the financial capital, the investor class. So the kind of activities that they're trying to implement are not particularly unique to Central Asia. They also happen in other parts of the world, in Africa, Latin America. The forms of rentierism is you know, similar. And again, that shouldn't be too surprising. It's not, you know, it's not. We shouldn't be looking out for uniqueness. We should also be looking out for similarities. Because why? Because capital has a tendency to universalize its practices. The structural dimension of capital and rentierism is similar throughout the world. It's not something that is unique to particular national boundaries. So I suppose the other part to your, but you're right. But I don't want to somehow then, we don't somehow then suggest that, you know, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan is no different from what happens elsewhere. There are some uniqueness to the two countries in Central Asia. Firstly, it's about the natural resources, which is quite distinct from, let's say, what you get in Europe, right, or what you get in North America. The level of natural resources is just a high percentage of GDP. The importance of microfinance is very different to what you get in developed high-income countries. And I suppose the third difference I think is crucial here, Zenabek. The response of the state.
Okay.
The response of the state to enact violence upon its population, who protest against the harmful rentier capitalism, is, I think, it just is so different. The violence that the state perpetrates against its own citizens. I think that's also quite unique. That's not to say, what of course, the states in Europe and in North America don't also use violence. They do, right? But it's not of the same measure. And they also use other forms of violence, what sometimes called symbolic violence, as opposed to physical violence. So I think these are some of the similarities, as you rightly point out, but also some of the differences. I suppose it's also the nature of plutocracy. It's allowed to be. I mean, there is huge plutocracy in the White House, for instance. A lot of the rich are also senators, but they often tend to be kind of more discreet about their assets. Much more kind of putting their money into trust. Whereas here, it's much more open, I think, about their income there. You did ask other questions.
Should we expect any changes, international and then changes?
Yeah. I mean, well, this is the interesting part, isn't it, Zenobek? That the international treaties that are signed between the countries, investment treaties, they are regulated by what's called the international arbitration courts. Now, these international arbitration courts are staffed by corporate lawyers. And what's interesting about them is that they invariably take the side of the corporation over the state. The people who can ask for prosecution is not the state; it's the corporations that have to file a lawsuit. The state cannot file a lawsuit; only the corporations can file a lawsuit. So the system is highly rigged in favor of the corporations, and this is deliberate, right? It's deliberate because the interest. The designing of the system, what Amir and I call the neoliberal constitutionalism, the international law and order, the international treaties were designed by Western governments. Well, why? Because they wanted access to the natural resources, the key valuable resources in the global South, in countries like as well as also the former Soviet Union. So the system that they design and the limitations that they put on host countries like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan to push back against the interest of foreign corporations was designed to limit the capacity of states to bring prosecutions. And even when it is brought to prosecution, you have the tribunal, which is staffed by corporate lawyers who are largely in favor of, corporate industries. It's rigged.
Thank you.
Hope that gives you an idea.
Yeah, sure, thanks.
Feel free to email me afterwards. If there was something that I missed.
Sure, thank you very much.
Oh, but by the way, Zenobek, there is one other thing. There was an issue about, for example, the Chevron. It was fined almost like 50 million or something like that for violation of their industry, of polluting the environment, because they were engaged in illegal drilling beneath the regulated amount. So it was predatory drilling, and it kind of was potentially could cause earthquakes. And so and there was another case where the French company lost their license to Kashagan because the state withdrew their license because there were delays by the companies to drill. What you then saw was, and this is interesting, I think, you saw the Western diplomats and Western state officials going to Kazakhstan and saying, please don't punish our corporations. You had the at one point you had the Prime Minister of Italy going to Nur-Sultan, seeing President Nazarbayev saying, please don't punish our European energy corporations. So you have also this kind of, so as well as this kind of legal dimension, you also have this extrajudicial pressure that are placed upon host states to act in favor of international capital.
Okay, Alexei?
Yes, thank you very much, Balihar. Yeah, I have a few questions or comments. You can think of them as, I mean, one issue is that in your analysis of the moral justification, you rely a lot on legal justifications. And, you know, as we know, in the history of liberalism, legal justifications played a role because liberalism grew up in common law tradition. When judges, lawyers, they had a reputation, they had some kind of respect. But when we moved to, you know, late Soviet period and post-Soviet period law, you know, many observers describe the, you know, Russia or whatever, Central Asia as a lawless lands. And so, you know, when in the 90s you create market economy, or you create some kind of new class of capitalists, yeah. I mean, invocation of law would work only if law has some kind of appeal, respect, authority on its own, you know. And, you know, the 1990s in Central Asia, they were not places where you would find a lot of respect for law or some kind of and so that's one issue. Another issue is that a lot of analysis of, you know, Central Asian politics relies on the power of executive branch. And yeah, but you know, lawmaking is legislature, and then the judiciary you mentioned several times. I mean, these are the weakest players in the power map of Central Asian countries. So that's you know, that executive is where the power lies and where they can nationalize or privatize, and so that's another point is that you know, Kazakhstan's political economy is, you know, state involved. You know, the state is the main producer of GDP now. It's involved, you know, it's heavily involved in the economy through quasi-state enterprise and so forth. And so state is already there. In Kyrgyzstan now, Japarov, current president, he nationalized the Canadian, yeah, the gold mine, gold. So I don't know if, you know, what future holds. I don't expect anything reducing suffering of Kyrgyz people just because it will go. And so that's this is another way to think. And I thought of some other point, but I forgot it now. But this would be my comment.
Thank you, Alex. And again, some really good points there. Thank you for articulating them. I suppose I mean just taking on your last point about Kazakhstan. Yes, Kazakhstan has nationalized Kumtor, which was Canadian owned, but there are other gold mines which are Chinese and Russian owned, right? They haven't nationalized those, right? They're privately operated. And of course, whilst you know, and again, I suppose the point that Amir and I wanted to make here was that rent is private. It's not just about public sectors, you know, engaging in rent-seeking activities, but also the different forms that take place within the financial market, the property market. So, you know, a lot of the property developers engage in rentier activities. They may not be involved with states, right? It's a private interaction. The developers, the construction companies, the banks, you know, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, I think they're all private in fact, the majority of them are privately owned. In fact, I think the Kazakhs that own a considerable amount of banks in Kyrgyzstan, right? So especially one of the couple of the big ones. So these aren't got nothing to do with the state at all. But nevertheless, the state usually may be involved either in terms of allowing for this kind of rentier activities to take place, legitimizing it, decriminalizing it, desupervising it, allowing for the fraudulent practices that Anna and I point out. Or you got state officials either on as directors or they have shares in those companies, right? So they're kind of operating kind of not in their state capacity, but as private citizens, occupying this position both as economic elites as well as political elites. To your and again, it will be the same with Kazakhstan. Again, the state doesn't control all aspects of the economy. It can't do. It's impossible. It's not the Soviet Union. It's not command economy. It is a market economy dictated by prices, in which ownership is spread. It may be concentrated, but it's much more spread out and of course it doesn't belong to the workers, right? It belongs to the few and the privileged. And in terms of power, you're absolutely right. We did focus largely on the executive and the judiciary, but there's another element which is crucial to power relationships, which is the international financial institutions, IMF and the World Bank. They were a considerable part of this story, in which they pushed through the liberalization of the financial sector, the property sector, instituting private property rights, which were largely designed in support of the property class. The power of the international community to erect the infrastructure of the international investment treaties. That's got nothing to do with the executive branch in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. It was international order which established that. And to your point about moral justification, property rights, it's a complex thing, insofar as there is always a moral dimension to protecting property rights, the sanctity of law, respect for rule of law, the respect for rule and law and order, respecting people's property. That it does have a moral dimension. You can't get away from the moral dimension of the power to protect property rights. But you know what? If that fails, then you have violence. You have the state crushing down on those who don't respect it. And we saw this, I think, in how Kazakhstan, for instance, tried to deal with the informal settlements in Shanarak and other places, where people, quite right, where people took ownership of land and built illegal housing that were seen as illegal. I mean, in that sense, they weren't respecting property right laws, right? They were driven by necessity to meet their basic needs. The state tries to get them evicted. There are judicial edicts to say that people in Shamrak should leave. By the way, the same in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek as well. That fails. So what do you do? Well, in the case of what happened in Shamrak, the state tried to demolish the Shamrak settlements. Or in the case of in Kyrgyzstan, they sought to incorporate the illegal settlements into part of the state apparatus, into the legal structures. So it's I suppose I want to recognize the importance of moral dimension to respecting property rights, but also how people also use moral dimensions to violate property as well. So it's a very ambiguous relationship. So it doesn't necessarily, morality doesn't necessarily mean respecting property. It can also lead to its violation.
Yes, I agree. I mean, even when we talk about when we see how government reacted to January riots, you know, they are much more active in compensating businesses that were destroyed during pogroms, or to destroying the ruined residence of Nazarbayev, rather than to the victims, of torture or victims of the riots. So that's human life versus economic asset.
Or between what's important. Is profit more important than people's lives? I mean that's the fundamental, isn't it? I mean, do we respect the property rights of the rich and powerful, or do we try to ensure that the economy? And this goes back to the point of Brian's earlier on, which is what kind of economy, what kind of proposal would we want? What would the alternative economy? An alternative economy would be one in which doesn't merely respect property rights to the rich and powerful, but tries to make property and ownership for the benefit of people's lives, right? Whether that be greater industrial economic democracy, whether it be ensuring that people can't have multiple homes, limiting the capacity of people to have ownership of shares, all these elements that you can kind of think about. So how can we create a moral economy which allows for the flourishing of everybody equally, right, rather than just for the few? Because what we have at the moment in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan is an economy for the few, in which the few are able to benefit, able to travel, have nice homes. The rest suffer. Rest live in cramped accommodation, paying exorbitant prices, suffering. So this is not an economy. This is an immoral economy. So we need to kind of think about how we could redesign the economy, which pays more attention to use value as opposed to exchange value. Because all too often what happens in capitalism, everything's turned into an exchange value. Everything, and then you have the infrastructure that supports the exchange value. I think what we need to be getting back to, is the idea that we should be doing things because they're useful. Assets should be used to enable people to live well, rather than assets to be used to enrich a small group of people. So Brian, can I just take this opportunity just to say hi to Sabira? Hi, it's a colleague of mine from Almaty. Hey, hi Sabira. I did see you, so it's good to see you, and I'm glad you were able to join us. Hi Sabira.
So there's one last question in the chat. I'm sorry.
To see you.
We can spend a little time chatting at the very end, but would you be willing to answer this question that's in the chat from Carol?
Certainly. Yeah.
I'll go ahead and read it, and then you can answer. Thank you for your fascinating talk. Your argument focuses on the rents that the rich derive from their control of businesses operating in specific sectors. Those sectors tend to be ones that the state has a lot of influence over through granting of licenses, extraction rights, etc. And the control by the rich over their businesses is, for the most part, the product of their relationship, sometimes familial with powerful political figures and those figures' patronage. Many scholars would use the term neo-patrimonialism to refer to this kind of relationship. Focus their analysis on the clientelist networks that bind the rich with their political patrons, rather than on the rich as a discrete class. Could you reflect on the relative analytical leverage that the application of the concepts of neoliberalism and rentier capitalism to the conditions you've described?
Okay, great. No. That's a great question by Carol. We don't use the term. Amir and I, we don't use the term neo-patrimonialism. Partly because it goes back to the point that I was making about Plato and the caves. We mistaken the shadows as if they're real. the kinship networks, the familial ties, they're more of a product. They're more of an outcome of Rentierism. It's not what I call that the familiar. I mean, ask yourself the question: how come the familial, the clientelistic relationship? How come they're not involved in productive capital? How come they're not involved in making of goods and services, of factories, cars? How come they're not involved in actual manufacturing of key assets, of key goods and services? They invariably are congregated, very much concentrated in rentier sectors: finance, natural resources, telecom, and the real estate. These are rentier, rent extracting sectors. So the key issue here is, why would they be interested in these sectors? Because it's easy to make money out of them. It's what John Stuart Mill once called that people who make rentiers make money in their sleep. They don't economize, they don't risk, they don't work. It's easy to make money. They don't need to do anything. So I think to give the term patrimonialism or neo-patrimonialism doesn't really identify the cause of inequality, the cause of accumulation of income. It only shows who are the actual owners, but it doesn't tell us the structural dimension of why these things occur in the first place. As I said, it's interesting that these patronage, how come, as I said, they're not involved in actual making of goods and services, are they? They just own what allows them to make money, which is rent extraction. So I think the key analytical concept is rentierism. Now, whether this gets concentrated as it does in Kazakhstan, amongst a few, amongst those who are connected with the president or the circle of the president, well, that it can be. But to be honest, that doesn't matter so much. I'm not concerned about who gets it. I'm concerned about the structural nature of it. Would it? So I suppose another way of thinking about this: would I feel any better? Would I feel any better if the owners of these oil companies, banks, real estate were not part of the president, but were yourself, Brian, or Zenebek, or Sabira, or Alexei? Would I feel better that it was not them, but another group of people? Would that make it better? Well, no. The problem is still the same. Now, the very fact that it is closely linked to a certain group of people who are connected with the president, that adds more complexity, right? But it doesn't kind of get to the root issue, which is the structural nature of rentierism.
Great, thanks for that. All right, we're kind of crossed our limit now. If there's a short question, we can ask it, or I can just I'll turn off the recording and we can chit chat amongst ourselves a little bit. So nothing else?
No.
Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording now.